Hey everybody. So it's been almost 2 weeks or 2 weeks, something like that, since the last video, and in coronavirus time, I believe that's about 48 and a half centuries. So we've had a lot of developments that I want to get to, but I want to just sort of break this up into segments. I've been doing some longer videos. I want to try and keep these next few a bit more brief and digestible rather than putting in chapters and what have you with the timestamps. So without further ado, this is mostly a political show, and so I think I should address that first. But if you stay tuned, we'll have some other stuff. We'll go into some economics. We'll go into some more details about what's going on with coronavirus, etc. But yeah, let's just jump right in. Now, the topic of why Bernie Sanders' campaign didn't succeed is pretty well-worn territory if you watch a lot of the political stuff that I watch. And, what it is that worked and didn't work has been chewed over and will probably continue to be chewed on for the next couple years, right? At least. But there has been a particular avenue that I haven't seen get a lot of attention yet. Really two, and those are the two things that I want to talk about in this video. So, in an earlier video, I think it was something like Bernie will lose unless something something, and basically I outlined in a couple of videos exactly the thing that happened and why we needed to keep it from happening. I said leave Klobuchar alone. Like we needed to not attack these people. We needed them to feel viable, because I knew that if all of them got out of the race, that too much of their support would end up in the remaining establishment candidates' hands, and that would almost certainly result in a Bernie Sanders defeat. The fact that it played out exactly that way doesn't make me feel good about being right, but it does indicate that folks like us that are looking at politics from a progressive perspective are still more or less pretty correct when we make these kinds of assessments. The one thing I'm a little, I guess, resentful towards some of my, the people that I watched, like Rising, Kyle Kalinske, the Turks, Young Turks, and everybody. I understand what they were doing. They were sort of doing the cheerleader thing, but there was very little talk, I think, and maybe the other thought was not to give the weapons that could defeat you to your enemy, so to speak. But there was not a lot of talk about how important it was to keep candidates in the race. And there was a lot of interest in attacking any particular establishment candidate the moment that they started gaining some support. Honestly, I'm pretty convinced that if Amy Klobuchar, for example, had some sort of thunderous rise to the top, that would not have resulted in people like Biden getting out of the race or people like Buttigieg getting out of the race. I think that if we had had a less established candidate on the establishment side, so to speak, get some momentum, that there would have been a less clear decision on their end, and they might have been unable to coalesce as effectively as they did. Like, for example, if Buttigieg had more clearly won in Iowa, and there was a clear winner in Iowa and a clear winner in North Carolina, that would have made it much harder for them to pick a lane. So by doing such a good job of tackling and taking down certain candidates before they had a chance to rise up, it made it so much easier for them to coalesce. So as much as there was a desire on the progressive media side to avoid talking about how important it was to avoid that coalescent thing, there was way too much attacking candidates we didn't need to hit. And the after effect of that was Biden took a single victory in North Carolina after losing 3 in a row, big time, and turning that into, well, he is obviously the one and only choice, and we're going to all coalesce around him and march forward as a unit and claim that victory. And Another component of this, and this is the second piece of this, that I'm seeing is how people are reacting on the progressive side is completely wrong. So the first piece is that we're seeing a lot of, blame being sent out towards younger voters and saying, you didn't turn out. You guys didn't show up to the polls. And because you didn't show up, we lost. Bernie Sanders' campaign bet everything on the idea that you would all show up. And because you didn't, we didn't win. And I want to say right now that technically that's true. There was not enough turnout, and as a result, we didn't get the momentum we needed. But there's a why behind that that's really important, that needs to get addressed and needs to become not just something we're aware of in our community, but something that becomes a rallying cry, a momentum that we build that creates a specific kind of reform in the voting process. And that is, essentially, we're seeing the kind of voter suppression tactics that were being used on minority populations in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s being now used on younger and poorer voters. So in 2013, there was a Supreme Court ruling back when Scalia was still alive, and it was called Shelby County V. Holder. Shelby County v. Holder essentially was an attack on the Voting Rights Amendment. And what that did was it took a look at these different components of the amendment and saw one particular one, which was essentially the enforcement mechanism of the entire amendment, that said that, if a law was going to be presented that could potentially be an infringement on voting rights, that there was this enforcement group that could overturn that ruling. And essentially, there was a judgment that was being made on each of these laws that would stop the law from being made official. That component of the amendment was stripped out. So essentially, murder is still illegal, but there are no cops there to arrest you for it. That's where the state of the Voting Rights Amendment is right now. So it's still illegal, the tactics that they're using, but they are allowed to get away with it because there is no mechanism to enforce that law. So, a too infrequently covered component of what's been happening around the states that did get to do their primaries was exactly this kind of thing. We saw in South Carolina, in Texas, in Florida, in Arizona, and many other places that held these primary votes, an enormous condensing of polling sites and closure of polling sites. And those are two different things, but they largely mean the same thing. So if you're closing it, it's pretty clear. You're closing a polling site, it's just no longer in service. You can no longer vote there, period. Condensing is essentially the same thing, but what they're saying is, instead of voting over here, you're going to vote over there. You're going to go to this other site, and you're going to go to the same site that this other town over here is using, and then this town over here is using, and that town over there is using. And so what they do is they bring all of these communities in to vote at a single location, and it creates those huge lines that we see. So what's happened here? Well, two things happened. In 2014, there was a midterm, and in 2018, there was another midterm. Where we saw people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez getting elected and a lot of others. The difference between 2014 and 2018 was, according to a Tufts University study, a more than 100% increase in the number of youth voters turning out in the 2018 election. So it made perfect sense for Bernie Sanders to assume and to build a campaign on the idea that that momentum would at least be consistent 2 years later with what it was in 2018. So what happened? How did all of that momentum, that doubling of youth voter turnout in 4 years, get squashed so immaculately? Well, it's the tactics that we're talking about. The Shelby County v. Holder ruling allowed them to do the following: condense, without any actual limitation, the amount of polling stations that they want. And for example, in the most recent primary in Milwaukee, in Wisconsin, the city of Milwaukee, their largest city, who has a median age of around 35 years old, obviously millennials, obviously very pro-Bernie city, saw their 180 polling stations condensed down to just 5 in the middle of a pandemic. At the height, arguably, of this phase of the pandemic, we saw almost no options for people to show up in person. And this is important because older voters are far more likely to do mail-in ballots, and younger voters are far more likely to vote in person. So when you see college towns, when you see millennial-heavy parts of the country getting enormous amounts of polling condensate, what would you call that? Enormous number of polls being condensed or eliminated, it's very clear that they're targeting this. Because if you go into those suburbs, you go into areas that are wealthier, you go into areas that are more rural, more conservative, there's no problems like that. I happen to be in a town that's, that does well, that's relatively conservative, and 90% of them have master's degrees. So if they're not establishment Democrat, they're probably Republican. And what you can see when you go to the polling stations here, as you walk in, there's probably 2 open voting booths that aren't even being used. There's a couple people around, and it just trickles in, and everybody gets serviced. There's plenty of booths. There's never a line. And if there's a line, it's like you're the next person up and there's one person in front of you in the booth. So it's very clear that when you see the kind of situations that are happening in college towns like Austin, Texas, saw 8-hour lines, I believe it was, they were saying. I mean, people way past, even in California, way past the official closure time for the polls. People in huge lines, thousands of people in line. That's not an accident. And that does 2 things. It limits the number of people who are willing and able to arrive and show up and make a vote that day, because not everybody can afford to wait all day in a line. And the other thing it does is it suppresses future turnouts. When somebody realizes that they had to wait 8 hours in line to cast a vote in the previous year, it makes them less likely to want to come out and do it again the next year. So this is on purpose, and this is illegal, but it's being unenforced because of the Supreme Court ruling. So millennials can be beat up all they want. Our generation has been attacked and accused of all kinds of things for the last 20 years. We've been told we're like the worst, the laziest. Now we're being told we didn't show up to the vote. But there's a concerted effort that is legitimately suppressing the vote in the same way we've seen it done in the past. And of course, it's going to work. So if we're going to get serious about reform, if we're going to get serious about voter turnout, it requires us to get realistic about the causes and how we're going to solve them. We cannot get voter turnout when there is a legalized system of illegal voter suppression activity in place throughout the country. And when we talk about establishment, we're not just talking about, Republicans, which is, of course, what all of the news stories we're talking about in Wisconsin. Oh, it's the Republican courts and the Republican blah, blah, blah. It's not Republicans. It's the same exact things that were being used in all the other states, okay? But they changed the excuse each time. So in Wisconsin, it was the Republicans' fault that this happened. But when we were looking over at, Arizona and Florida, the story was, well, we're condensing the polling stations because we don't have enough cleaning supplies, and we want to make sure all the cleaning supplies are all in the same place so that we can keep everything clean, which of course is insane, because the more people you pack into a single location, the more high risk it becomes. And cleaning supplies have nothing to do with it. And before that happened, they just weren't making excuses at all. It was too below the radar. You didn't see stories on MSNBC, or you didn't see stories in the New York Times, or see stories in all of these major sources of media talking about the South Carolina voter suppression that was happening then, talking about the Texas voter suppression that was happening then. But you found stuff in New York Magazine. You found it in other places, but not the big guys. So if we're going to be realistic about creating change that allows all people to participate, we need to take advantage of something that's going to be happening coming up in November, and that is most likely that we're still going to see a lot of concern about the safety of voting at polling stations around the country in the general election. Progressives will not have the same ability to be represented in that because we lost our chief candidate. But we're still going to have a lot of people running for office in smaller elections that we need to have get in. And we can ally ourselves with the establishment Democrats in promoting the idea of mail-in ballots being sent to all voters. Now that they know they've just got their Biden candidacy through, they're going to be far more inclined to open up and create an avenue for voting policies that will benefit them. And we really need to capitalize on that as progressives so that we're going to be able to actually get permanent things in place that will allow voter participation to stay high in future elections as well. It's a commonly known statistic that most people who do mail-in voting are on the older side. It's harder for them to get out. They can't afford to stand in lines. And they're more comfortable with using, a conventional mail, which to younger people kind of feels like churning butter, like a pilgrim, right? We're not comfortable or familiar or used to using the mail system, but it's really pretty easy, right? But if you sent a mail-in ballot to every registered voter in the state, and you certainly could because we register through, the motor vehicle, and they know where we live. They have all our information. They could just send us one automatically. If we could create a system where we're automatically sent these ballots, we would be able to see a huge spike in the amount of voter turnout. And so I think this is an important thing. As a progressive, I'm angry with establishment people. I don't like them. I want to defeat them. But we need to work with them on this one thing, which is reforming the voting system so that automatically everyone receives mail-in ballots. If we do that, our voting turnout will be high, very high. And I think they'll be far more receptive to that in this one specific election than the establishment will ever be on the left in any future election after it. And that's because they have a razor focus on defeating Trump. And if we can say, you know what, we'll help you defeat Trump, but you need to give us this so that we can have our chance in the future, I think it's our best bet. Guys, there's a lot more to say on this topic and others, but I want to cut it off here. We're already running longer than I wanted to. So what I will say is, I got to underline that one more time. If we want to defeat establishment candidates, if we want to defeat Republican candidates, we need higher turnout. The only way to get higher turnout is to make voting more accessible. The only way to make voting more accessible is to get establishment candidates and representatives on our side on this issue. So, talk to people. Get your parents, your boomer parents, or whatever it is, talk to other people in the progressive side. Create some enthusiasm around the idea of promoting a willingness to vote for Joe Biden, as much as we don't want to, in exchange for access to votes. That's it. Because if we get access to votes, we get everything else. We need to do that. I hope you hear it. I hope you pass it on. Please like, please subscribe, share it. I don't even care if you like it. Share it. Okay? We need to get this idea out because I've been right on every other video. Look back. I was right. We needed to keep candidates in. We needed, Biden to stay weak. We needed to have Klobuchar and others stay in the race. Every video in my past, you're going to see I was right about that. I'm right about this too. Okay? So check this out. Make it happen. Thank you.